So let's just start at the most basic level here. What is private equity? What constitutes a private equity firm? And how has private equity, as a part two, reshaped the American economy?
It's a great question. And I confess, I didn't really know what private equity was until I was about a third of the way through the project. So none of your viewers or listeners should feel bad for not being totally sure here. And I should say right off the bat, as I normally do, that this is all in my personal capacity and doesn't necessarily reflect the opinions of the Justice Department. So, what is private equity? Private equity firms use a little bit of their own money, some investor money, and a whole lot of borrowed money to buy up companies. They then make financial and operational changes to those companies with the goal of selling them for a profit a few years later. So it's a very simple idea, but it has often a lot of bad consequences across industries. And to your second part of your question about sort of where is private equity having an impact, it's pretty much everywhere. Private equity firms spent over $1 trillion buying companies last year. And for context, the entire US GDP is about $25 trillion. So it's not an insubstantial part of
Wow.
our economy. So it's everything from going to your veterinarian or your OBGYN, going to an emergency room, going to a nursing home. Even in some cities, the very water that you drink is provided by a private equity firm. So it tends to surround us.
I mean, the nursing home example is one that I believe you start your book off with in the introduction, and it's I would say some of our viewers may have heard this story before, but it's infamous for a reason. The Carlyle Group buying the company Manor Care for $6 billion, hollowing it out, healthcare violation or health code violations, I should say. The care towards the nursing home patients was horrendous. Bugs and dirt, layoffs of actual staff. I mean, talk about that story in particular because it's a great example of the dynamic you describe.
Well, all those things that you described happen. Carlyle, which is one of the largest private equity firms in America, bought up Manor Care and then executed a lot of fairly standard tactics. They did what's called a sale leaseback, where they required Manor Care to sell all of the property and then lease it back to itself, which generated a quick sort of hit of cash, but now meant that Manor Care had this sort of unending obligation to pay for property it used to own. Carlyle executed transaction fees and management fees, fees that Manor Care essentially paid for the privilege of being owned by the private equity firm. And what's really interesting to your point about this story is, there wasn't a spike in health code violations. There were complaints about bugs. When a resident actually died at the facility, her family sued for wrongful death. But this is what a really important part about, I think, what causes so many problems in private equity. When they sued for wrongful death, Carlyle was actually able to get the case against it dismissed by saying, we actually don't technically own the nursing home chain. Rather, we just advise a series of funds whose limited partners, through several shell corporations, ultimately own Manor Care. And that was enough to confuse the judge to get the case dismissed. And it meant that Carlyle, even though it effectively had operational control over the nursing home, wasn't going to be held responsible for the consequences.
I mean, that is shocking, I'm sure, to a lot of people, but that is and a part of the structure of private equity, the fact that they just do not have legal liabilities in the way that you would expect, given the kind of overhaul that they implement at the companies that they end up buying. I mean, they also load them up with debt, and I want to talk about that piece in a second. But you're a lawyer, you work in the Justice Department. What is the legal framework that allows private equity to both have this incredibly kind of tidal wave of effect on the companies that they end up buying, but have no legal liability when it comes down to brass tacks?
So, and with anything in the law, we lawyers are annoying. There are details and nuances to this, but the basic issue is a doctrine called corporate veil piercing. So, you and I, we have our, invest, to the extent we've got any retirement savings, probably invested in an index fund or something like that. And you've got stock in hundreds of different companies. Well, a really foundational idea in corporate law is you can't get sued successfully for things that those companies do. And it kind of makes sense. Like you and I probably don't have much control over, what Walgreens or DuPont or whoever it is that you're invested in. You don't have much say over their operations. Um, Private equity firms benefit from that same protection, yet they often have majority stakes in their companies and can effectively dictate their operations. So it's a situation where, in some ways, the law hasn't really caught up to the business practice yet, where these firms are able to essentially control their portfolio companies, but then if something goes wrong, they can't be successfully sued for them.
So, I mean, the law needs to catch up, right? I think that's the lesson here. Like that would have to, I guess, go through Congress in that way, or is there a sense that there could be some executive action taken?
Yeah, there's a whole range of things that can happen, both on that issue and on others where sort of the private equity business model leads to often bad consequences. Congress can certainly act here, but there are a lot of different levers of power. On that specific issue, actually, it's an area where states and localities are probably more important. A lot of this is state common law, and you just need jurisdictions like Delaware, New York, California, Pennsylvania to update their laws to sort of clarify who can be held responsible. So I think that there are a lot of different areas people can look to for action.
Gotcha. Well, all right, then let's talk about a few of the other examples that you touch on as well. Some people might be aware of, like the Toys R Us example, private equity, these major private equity instances where companies went bankrupt and were bought up. J. Crew, Aeropostale is another. Friendlies was one that that hit home to my heart because that was my favorite place to go growing up on the East Coast. It's like it's a fast food chain, but ice cream sundaes and things like that. Those are the one I used to go to with my family all the time, just shuttered up. And you realize, oh, it's because they handed the keys to private equity. And so this happens really when these companies are in a bit of financial distress, right? If you don't mind explaining kind of the circumstances behind it and then behind those examples as well.
Yeah, so maybe we can focus on Friendlies because it's a
Sure.
really interesting story. So this is a, sort of an iconic diner chain in the Northeast. It's founded by these two brothers during the Great Depression. And it becomes this regional institution. In 2007, it's bought up by a private equity firm called Sun Capital, which then executes a lot of the tactics that we were just talking about sale leasebacks and, transaction fees, management fees, and so forth. Ultimately, they drive the company into bankruptcy. But the really interesting thing that happens is Sun Capital wasn't just Friendly's owner, it was also Friendly's largest lender. And the reason that they did that is lenders often get control of a company in bankruptcy. And so Sun Capital was able to execute this move where it sold Friendly's from itself to itself, which is sort of this sort of legal magic trick. And the reason that they did that is through that bankruptcy process, they were able to push off the pension obligations that Friendly's had onto what's called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which is this quasi-government agency. And so the result was Sun Capital was able to keep control of Friendly's, but now it was able to abandon the pension obligations, which is a tactic that's been tried by Sun Capital many times and by many other private equity firms, by one analysis, at least 50 different times over a 15-year period.
Where does that leave the pension funds? And we can talk more about how it's a lot of pension funds are heavily invested in private equity.
So in that case, I believe the PBGC was able to pay the outstanding pension obligations. Retirees were not so lucky in at least some companies. Sun Capital bought up Mars Supermarkets, as I understand it, for essentially warehouse workers. Their pensions were significantly cut, while the pension fund for the company's executives remained fully funded. I believe by one analysis by some folks at Harvard, pensioners have lost at least $1 billion through these sorts of deals by private equity and other firms.
It's just the fact that so many of our retirees via pension funds are subject to a lot of this insecurity is pretty concerning to me. Can you expand on that point? How this came to be? How pensions became kind of intertwine with private equity in this way?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned at the outset, private equity firms need money to buy up companies. And a lot of that comes from pension funds. So, historically, the money that private equity firms get comes from pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, which are, the funds of foreign governments. There have been really interesting stories of cases where union pension funds are being used to buy up companies, and then ultimately the companies engage in sort of union busting activities. So there's sort of a snake eating its own tail sort of quality to it. I think the really interesting trend we're seeing is private equity firms are now trying to get access to 401k funds, which historically they haven't. So if you invest through, a 401k fund manager, it's possible that in the next few years, your money could be going to private equity firms and funding these sorts of acquisitions.
Again, I return to it's insane how this is legal, but I mean, how is it even legal for private equity to use so much money that just isn't theirs, right? So much borrowed money for them to make these acquisitions. I mean, it's a little bit of theirs, right? A little is investor money too, but so much of this is borrowed from things like, what you just described.
Yeah. So, the real interesting sort of magic trick of most private equity deals is it usually involves a lot of debt, but it's debt that the acquired company is responsible for paying, not the private equity firm. So, when you buy a company like Toys R Us and use several $billion to do it, most of that money is going to be money that Toys R Us has to borrow. And if Toys R Us fails, the private equity firm can nominally walk away. And in fact, I believe in that case, the private equity firms more than made back their own particular investment, even though the company failed. I think why is so much debt being used? Historically, it's been because there have been such low interest rates, set in part by the Federal Reserve. So there's been an enormous amount of cheap money sort of floating around. Now that interest rates are going up, I think we may see sort of more instability in private equity acquisitions. And, some of these deals might start looking bad, and, private equity firms might struggle to unload them or sell them to other companies.
What are some of the ramifications of that you would predict, as, because we've had how many interest rate hikes? Nearly 10 at this point, since the start of the pandemic?
That's a really quick, I'm a humble lawyer. Like, that's really a question for more a financial expert. But I will say, I mean, it's interesting. And just in the trade reporting, you're seeing that private equity firms are struggling to offload companies in a way that they weren't just a few years ago. So, it could mean more instability for private equity portfolio companies, more bankruptcies and so forth. The interesting thing is private equity firms, portfolio companies, at least according to one study, were already 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as comparable businesses not owned by private equity firms. So, you may see a further increase in that.
I wanted to ask you a bit more about the notion of financialization and how private equity companies have been so instrumental in the financialization of our economy, much more money, a disproportionate amount, I guess, since maybe the 80s and 90s going to the finance sector, right? What is that? How does private equity play a role in that? And what are some of the effects on our economy when it's so heavily financialized in that way?
Yeah. So, there's really interesting research about how, when the financial aspect of an economy becomes sort of too large, it's actually a drag on the overall effect of the economy rather than a benefit. And the United States has sort of long surpassed that, according to some research. I think the short version of this is that basically after the financial crisis of 2008, the investment banks all converted into what are called bank holding companies. And from a regulatory perspective, just became a lot less interesting. They became much more conservative institutions. And private equity really took on the mantle of the investment banks, to such an extent that private equity firms are really expanding well beyond private equity. They're buying up the hedge fund units of investment banks. They're expanding into infrastructure, life sciences. Private credit is a huge thing. There's a really interesting quote from an analyst, the effect of which was Blackstone, the leading, by some measures, the largest private equity firm, he says, Blackstone reminds me of Goldman Sachs a decade ago. Wherever something interesting is happening, that's where they are. And that's reflected in the pay. The head of Blackstone made 10 times as much as the head of Goldman Sachs last year. And I don't think the CEO of Goldman Sachs is terribly underpaid. To add one last thing to a rather long answer here, I think maybe the most interesting expansion in sort of financialization is that private equity firms are getting very involved into buying up insurance companies. And that's an area where they are buying up these businesses and potentially investing sort of insurance policyholders' money in sort of more risky or more opaque investments, which could have interesting effects.
I mean, certainly, and just it creates a level of instability where the economy is just it's floating above the rest of us, right? Where these decisions and the instability is happening within this sector, but like with so much of that money, I mean, you said $1 trillion spent buying companies in the last year when our GDP is 25 trillion. Like that creates. I mean, that contributes to income inequality is probably the short answer that I'm talking my way towards.
Yeah, no, I mean there are more. I'll have to remember the statistic. I believe that there are more people working in private equity making 100 million who have $100 million or more than there are people in all the rest of the financial industry and all professional athletes combined. So there, private equity is certainly a contributor to a handful of people becoming exceedingly wealthy.